Welcome back to the fourth day of our inauguration conference of the Korea Europe Center at the Institute of Korean Studies at Freie Universität Berlin. I hope you all enjoyed a short coffee or tea break. To those of you who joined the event just now, my name is Gabriel Dae-In. I am a research fellow here at the Institute of Korean Studies and will be your host for today. Now let me introduce you to our next speaker, my colleague and friend, Dr. Erik J. Ballbach. Dr. Erik J. Ballbach is a postdoc researcher and director of the Research Unit North Korea and International Security at Freie Universität Berlin's Institute of Korean Studies. Since 2017, he also serves as Korea Foundation Visiting Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, the SWP-Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. He obtained his master and PhD degree from the University of Trier in Germany. Dr. Ballbach's research focuses on North Korean and South Korean foreign and security policies, North Korea's participation in international institutions, identity politics on the Korean Peninsula, and multilateral institution building in East Asia. He has published numerous articles in national and international journals, book chapters, and policy pieces. He advises the German government as well as the European Union on Korea-related issues and participates in various informal Check 1.5 initiatives involving high-ranking representatives from the DPRK. And today he will be talking about the role of the EU in Korean Peninsula security affairs. The floor is yours, Dr. Ballbach.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my ongoing research. Today I'm speaking about the role of Germany and the EU in Korean Peninsula security affairs, and I will do so with a specific focus on what is possible, on the potentials for a greater involvement of Germany and the EU in said relations, and but also address the opportunities and challenges in this regard. Germany and, quite frankly, Europe as a whole are commonly seen as bystanders to Korean Peninsula security affairs. While German and EU policy on the security situation in Korea in recent years can undoubtedly be described as rather defensive, the recently published Indo-Pacific strategy of the German government and the currently negotiated EU strategy on the Indo-Pacific offer new opportunities for a more proactive role for both Berlin and Brussels. However, in order to carve out a realistic contribution Germany and the EU could make to Korean Peninsula security affairs, we need to understand both the domestic and the structural conditions that facilitate the rather passive stance of Germany and the EU. The presentation, therefore, first addresses the role of Korea and especially Korean Peninsula security affairs in Germany's recently published Indo-Pacific policy guidelines, and building on these observations, I secondly want to discuss both the major challenges, but also some of the more promising signs for a greater role for Germany and the EU in Korean Peninsula security affairs. In September 2020, Germany's Federal Foreign Office published the new policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific, making Germany at that time only the second EU member state to formulate a regional strategy after France. Just yesterday, Dr. Gudrun Wacker already gave a brilliant overview on the guidelines and the implications for the region, so I do not want to go too much into the details about the guidelines themselves, but rather look at what the new German and eventual European strategy signifies for Germany's and Europe's role in present and future Korean Peninsula security affairs. the new strategic policy formulated by the Federal Foreign Office clearly reflects the increased strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region, a region broadly defined as the entire region characterized by the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. The strategy, which is considered an inclusive one and as such is not directed against any state, is a reflection of Germany's basic objective to diversify its Asia policy. To that end, the guidelines emphasizes a number of issue areas in which Germany aims to enhance cooperation with the regional partners. For example, the fight against climate change, to strengthen the rule of law and human rights, and to expand economic relations and enhance exchange in the cultural, educational, and scientific spheres. Other topics include digital transformation, connectivity, and visionary technologies of the futures, issues which are all considered crucial for Germany's global competitiveness. At this point, however, it should be noted that regional security also has a special significance within the new strategy. The Indo-Pacific policy guidelines provide the first coherent and comprehensive document that lays out Germany's security interests in the region. As such, taking a closer look at what the document stipulates in the security sector in general is crucial for then addressing the challenges, but also the potential for a greater German and European involvement in Korean Peninsula security affairs in specific. The guidelines stipulate three sectors and areas in which the federal government aims to strengthen peace, security, and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. That is, increasing its security policy engagement, continue to implement measures for civil crisis prevention, conflict management, and peace building, and increasing its arms control and export control policy engagement in and with the Indo-Pacific. You can see a summary of the main points here in this slide. A glance at this slide clearly shows that Germany's new Indo-Pacific strategy aims at an increased engagement in regional security issues in three specific issue areas. At the same time, however, the resulting initiatives mainly focus on maritime security as well as non-traditional security challenges to the region, while traditional security challenges are addressed mostly indirectly. To understand this, it is crucial to acknowledge that the guidelines establish a direct nexus between prosperity in Europe and security in Asia. As is emphasized right at the beginning of the chapter on the security guidelines, without peace, security, stability, and good governance, it will not be possible to reap the benefits of ever greater economic integration. Free maritime trade routes and the maritime security are of vital importance to Germany as an open economy with global interests. It is mainly in the context of this economy security nexus that regional security policy related risks and threats, such as the North Korean nuclear weapons and missile program, unresolved territorial disputes about both land and maritime boundaries, conflicts over natural resources, and the growing rift between China and the US are interpreted. While the strategy intends to expand its security policy engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, the guidelines do not address most of the hard security challenges through direct measures and initiatives. Rather, the guidelines focus very clearly, like I said, on maritime security, as well as on non-traditional security challenges such as natural disasters, climate change, cyber threats, corruption, and piracy. Within those areas, however, the guidelines indeed offer a whole range of initiatives, such as creating a substantive and legally binding code of conduct between China and the ASEAN member states for the South China Sea, various measures to maintain the rule-based maritime order in the Indo-Pacific, such as training and further training courses on the law of the sea and the regular participation of observers in regional marine exercises, but also monitoring UN sanctions against North Korea. If we take a look at what the policy guidelines actually stipulate in this regard, and if we build on this brief discussion of Germany's involvement in Indo-Pacific security affairs as envisioned by the guidelines, let me now address the implications for Germany's and eventually the EU's involvement in Korean Peninsula security affairs. I want to start by stating the obvious, namely that South Korea, well before the publication of the guidelines, was of course already considered an important partner for Germany in the region. And as such, Seoul is already embedded in numerous dialogues, both bilaterally with Germany and other EU member states, and multilaterally with the EU and NATO, for example, through the Partners Across the Globe and the Individual Partnership and Cooperation Program. However, it is obvious that the guidelines have visibly elevated the role of South Korea in Germany's Asia strategy, and is expected to be pretty much the same when the EU formulates its Indo-Pacific strategy. Seoul, along with several other partner countries in the region, is designated a core cooperation and a value partner in 4 specific issue areas, that is security cooperation, fair and sustainable trade, digital transformation, and cultural exchange. So given that security cooperation is designated as one of 4 major areas in which cooperation with South Korea is expected to be increased, it seems surprising that the guidelines only implicitly address the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, for example, by pointing to the security challenges posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. But apart from calling for a stronger monitoring of UN sanctions against North Korea, no direct initiatives are proposed, and for the time being, it is not to be expected that the security situation on the Korean Peninsula will, at least in the short term, become a field of increased German and European involvement. Yet, while it will be certainly most difficult to set visible signs in the traditional security sector, both because of limited capacities and geopolitical challenges, a greater involvement in Korean Peninsula security affairs is not impossible in the longer term. There are, however, a number of challenges we have to address and have to discuss, of course, if we even think about a new role for Germany and Europe in Korean Peninsula security affairs. One of them being South Korea's geopolitical dilemma. As opposed to other regional states such as Vietnam, India, and Japan, South Korea's official response to the publication of the policy guidelines was rather restrained. Neither did the media report on the publication of the guidelines, nor were any official statements released concerning the issue. It has to be noted, however, that this was not due to, let's say, any skeptical attitude of the South Koreans towards the contents, objectives, and proposed initiatives of the German Indo-Pacific strategy. In fact, both German and Korean officials have confirmed a generally positive reaction of Seoul to the publication guidelines. Rather, this restraint in openly addressing security affairs in the region, which is apparent in both South Korea's bilateral contacts and in their public statements, is a result of Seoul's extremely challenging geopolitical situation. It is against this background that South Korea for long appeared reluctant to adopt the Indo-Pacific language that now permeates across the foreign policy discourse of other US allies and partners in the region. In fact, South Korea already showed a similar restraint after the US revealed the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in 2017. while other US regional allies and partners such as Japan, Australia, India, but also the ASEAN clarified, enhanced, and coordinated their own approaches and strategies to the Indo-Pacific, with that supported by the US. Pointing out that earlier formulations of the Quad and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy were associated with Japan, some observers have suggested that bilateral tensions with Tokyo would explain South Korea's reluctance to adopt the Free and Open Indo-Pacific concept. Similar concerns have apparently been raised in Germany's early communication of its own guidelines to their South Korean counterparts. However, given that the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy is a multilateral and dynamic framework associated more with the US and Australia than with Japan, and given that South Korea's initial concerns that the policy guidelines by the German government might get too deep into Japanese-US waters have been discounted, this is certainly not the main driver behind South Korea's initial ambivalence to the Indo-Pacific strategy. The dominant factor driving Seoul's policy stance in this regard lies with China and the Moon Jae-in government's desire for policy autonomy. South Korea has to carefully navigate between its own position within the South Korea-US alliance, its bilateral relationship with Japan, and its relationship with China as well as North Korea. As Beijing sees most of such initiatives like the Free and Open Indo-Pacific as a balancing strategy orchestrated by the US and its allies, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy is perceived as aiming at containing China's rising power and regional influence. In the same vein, however, the Moon administration understands the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy as a strategy driven by geopolitical competition between the US and China. Adopting the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy would therefore complicate South Korea's relations with Beijing, South Korea's largest trading partner and a major stakeholder in the question of peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. While it is certainly true that other countries in the region are faced with a similar dilemma of choosing between, so to say, or navigating between China and the US, for South Korea, the quest for greater foreign policy autonomy is at the heart of national identity. This makes it impossible for South Korea to openly embrace and internalize the Free and Open Indo-Pacific framework to the extent of other US allies. Rather, it seems that Seoul offers quiet diplomatic support to avoid overly antagonizing Beijing and avoid Chinese punitive measures such as the 2017 bans on South Korean products and tourism. Recognizing the constraints of an intensifying China-US rivalry on its foreign policy, South Korea carefully seeks to diversify its economic and strategic options and therefore prefers to formulate its own Indo-Pacific strategy instead of adopting the Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy. So it is against this background that the Moon government launched its new Southern policy to boost ties with ASEAN states and India. We will hear more about this in the presentation coming tomorrow, which will address South Korea's new northern and southern policies. Apart from these geopolitical, from this geopolitical dilemma of Seoul, there are other reasons, of course, why, or other challenges to a greater EU and German involvement in Korean Peninsula security affairs. One of them being the EU's own sanctions approach, which, in my view, limits Europe's space for diplomacy, which would be necessary to increase Germany's and the EU's role in Korean Peninsula security affairs. This critical engagement strategy formulated by the EU has been the basis for the EU's North Korea policy for almost a quarter of a century. Most of its advocates praise the approach for its flexibility, as it is set to avoid the restrictions and escalation risks associated with a policy based on conditions and linkages, and makes it possible for Europe to apply pressure, for example, through sanctions, but also offer incentives, for example, through humanitarian aid provision, economic cooperation, or political dialogue vis-à-vis North Korea in what is said to be a flexible manner. These different policies and policy options of the critical engagement strategy are reflected by several phases of EU-North Korea relations, from a more active engagement in the mid-1990s to the early 2000s, a more critical engagement variant until 2013-2014, to the current policy of active pressure. So while Europe's critical engagement strategy was a promising starting point, so to say, for a coherent and sustainable foreign policy towards the DPRK, the past quarter of a century has shown that critical engagement did not promote a comprehensive European strategy vis-à-vis the Korean Peninsula in general and North Korea in specific. The strategy instead proved to be highly dependent on political circumstances and has failed both on the level of its strategic objectives and on the level of its strategic calculation, thereby further weakening Europe's role in East Asian and especially Korean Peninsula security affairs. Firstly, the critical engagement approach has failed to achieve its stated objectives, that is, to support a lasting diminution of tensions on the Korean Peninsula and in the region through a denuclearized North Korea, to uphold the international non-proliferation regime, and to improve the situation of human rights in the DPRK. With North Korea's nuclear and missile program significantly advanced and tensions on the Korean Peninsula hardly decreasing, the non-proliferation regime noticeably weakened, and the human rights situation in North Korea not improving, the goals of the EU's critical engagement strategy have not been achieved, to put it very mildly. To argue that critical engagement has failed, however, to achieve its stated objectives is not, of course, to say that Europe and Germany would pursue the wrong objectives, but rather to argue that critical engagement is the wrong methodology to achieve those objectives. Secondly, and this is my main point here, Brussels' critical engagement strategy has also failed on a strategic level, for the era of active pressure has had distinctly negative strategic consequences for the EU. That is, the strategy of active pressure promotes a passive and reactive North Korea policy, expressed most vividly by a singular focus on restrictive measures and a halt of official dialogue. This, in turn, has promoted an even more diminished role by the EU in East Asian security affairs. In line with the EU's active pressure strategy against North Korea and the subsequent strengthening of the sanctions regime, Brussels simultaneously decreased its political engagement of North Korea, ultimately leaving only some informal dialogue channels and individual engagement initiatives by specific member states. What's more, the EU fully linked tangible progress in the nuclear issue, even to the point of demanding CVID, to the development of other aspects of its relationship with the DPRK. What this means in turn is that the EU made progress in the one area in which it virtually has no diplomatic clout, a precondition for developing other aspects of its relationship with North Korea. As such, the EU's disengagement promoted a further decrease in diplomatic influence in security affairs on the Korean Peninsula and wider East Asia, and a further diminishing of its role and a further diminishing of the space for diplomacy with North Korea. those challenges, and we could of course discuss many more of the challenges to a greater involvement of Germany and the EU in peninsular security affairs. Despite all those challenges, however, it is important to acknowledge that the formulation of a new Indo-Pacific strategy also offers the opportunity for a greater role for Germany and Europe in Korean Peninsula security affairs, if not in the short term, but at least in the longer term. The fact that Germany did publish the guidelines at all is already remarkable, both in the sense that Berlin finally spoke up and formulated a coherent strategy with specific offers to the states in the region, but also in the sense that the guidelines laid the foundation for a potential European Indo-Pacific strategy. Respective discussions to that end are already underway with an initiative promoted by Germany, France, and the Netherlands. So while the security situation on the Korean Peninsula is not directly addressed in the guidelines, most notably due to a lack of resources and a different strategic focus, like I said, on maritime security and non-traditional security challenges, the guidelines nonetheless offer all the political tools necessary for a greater involvement of Berlin and Brussels in Korean Peninsula security affairs. For instance, Germany has already significantly increased its resources and engagement in the field of stabilization and mediation in the past years, including in the Indo-Pacific region, a development largely based on the German government policy guidelines on preventing crisis, managing conflicts, and building peace adopted in 2017. Also, the guidelines explicitly state that Germany will campaign more strongly for the use of arms control and confidence-building regimes by Indo-Pacific countries and will promote regional arrangement in this context. Berlin is working to expand existing arms control instruments and to develop new collective security approaches. To this end, it will support cooperative security measures in the region. The federal government is also working to strengthen and expand security policy engagement with and within the region through a variety of initiatives. So to this end, Germany undertakes specific measures to aid the European Union in raising its profile as a regional security actor and extending its field of action on the basis of the global strategy on foreign and security policy. As we are now basically in the middle of the process of Europeanizing the German Indo-Pacific strategy, like I said, respective discussions are underway at the moment, there is the possibility of incorporating the security situation on the Korean Peninsula into an eventual EU strategy, not least because any regional strategy formulated by the EU ultimately cannot keep quiet about one of the most pressing political challenges in the region. At the same time, however, and this is my closing argument, this is of course exactly where the difficulty lies, because it is also the sector in which Germany and Europe, for that matter, are comparatively weak. As such, the German strategy focuses on issue areas and initiatives in and with which Germany and Europe can actually make a tangible contribution. This is what we need to understand when we discuss Germany's policy guidelines for the Indo-Pacific region, namely that this is a strategy which can be further developed. What we see right now is, so to say, a first step, and it clearly focuses on existing initiatives, bringing together existing initiatives, and it focuses on issue areas in which the German government at the moment can actually make tangible contribution. And it seems like in the short term, given the lack of resources, the security situation on the Korean Peninsula is not an issue area in which the German federal government sees a role for itself, at least for itself alone. So we have to debate and discuss, especially in the coming month when Europe formulates its Indo-Pacific strategy, what Europe can actually offer to South Korea, to North Korea, and the major players in the region. But like I said before, the European Union, if a strategy is formulated on the Indo-Pacific, cannot simply keep quiet about the conflict on the Korean Peninsula, the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, as one of the major conflicts in the region. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm very happy to take questions and looking forward to the discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ballbach. It is always good and deeply informative listening to you. Before I forgot to make some technical announcements, let me do that first to the audience. First of all, the lecture will be recorded and uploaded online later. And second, if you have any questions to Dr. Ballbach, please use the chat feature and send the questions directly to me, and I will read them out to Dr. Ballbach. Before the first questions are written down and sent to me, I will use the power embedded in me as the host and ask you the first question. We often hear, and not only from you, but also from other experts, about the strategies of the European Union. But when it comes to issues regarding the Korean Peninsula, especially the sanctions against North Korea, I often get the feeling that Germany and the EU use their policy on North Korea to appease their allies from the US. On the other hand, we can hear many voices of European experts in that field, like you, who raise criticism about the strict sanctions against North Korea. Why do you think that the decision makers in Germany and the EU don't take into account these voices? Is it just due to a hardly existing impact of academia on the political world? Or is there just too little to gain from this region? Or is my observation correct that the EU uses Korea to appease their allies?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I would say that the decision makers are in contact with the experts in the field. But of course, we have to understand the situation of the German federal government. We have to take into the account the situation and geopolitical challenges for the German government and the EU at large, of course, also. There is an immense third-party pressure, and especially there was an immense third-party pressure on the EU to support the sanctions regime against North Korea. We should not forget that this sanctions regime is not only a UN sanctions regime, but also consists of autonomous EU sanctions. And here Germany, France, and before Brexit, the UK have been driving forces in pushing autonomous sanctions of the EU as well. There was enormous third-party pressure previously from the conservative South Korean government, but of course, especially also from the US under Donald Trump, to thoroughly implement UN sanctions. And like I said before, the E3 have pushed for autonomous sanctions within the EU as well. Is it an appeasement? I'm not quite sure if it's appeasement. I would say there was over time a lack of political will for a greater political engagement. Like I said before, once the sanctions regime has developed to the status it is now, it was developed hand in hand with decreasing the political dialogue with the DPRK. The engagement initiatives of the EU with North Korea decreased. So there are numerous factors that play into the current situation where we are now. What is noteworthy, however, is that the German Indo-Pacific strategy, and we can expect that this will be the same for the EU strategy eventually on the Indo-Pacific, is rather an inclusive one. So it is not directed against any state, and it is also not directed against North Korea. The situation in which we are now, I would say, is not very conducive for a greater political engagement, given that the sanctions are the way they are at the moment. But I see a greater potential for greater engagement, at least in the future.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Ballbach, for your elaborative answer. It seems that we are still waiting for some questions by the audience. So I would also like to ask you, perhaps in the spirit of the new Korea Europe Center here in Berlin, what do you wish for and what do you advise to the new generation of young scholars who want to research on North Korea? Take your time.
First of all, I would say it is a very interesting field for research, and it is a very necessary field for research. Of course, it is not the most easiest country to do research on, especially in the situation in which we are now giving the COVID-related restrictions. But I think we have shown during the last couple of years that research on North Korea is not only possible, but that it is extremely important. Mainly because much of the discourse on North Korea has been, at least in the past, dominated not by scholars and academics, but mainly by the media discourse. And we all know and are aware of how the media discourse on North Korea is structured. So I would say this field is extremely important for the future. And the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years have shown a great diversification of the field of North Korean studies, both in the sense of what is actually possible. There is much more research material than 15, 20 years ago. And this is reflected mainly by a much broader a broadening of the field of North Korean studies beyond what I am researching now, mainly security and foreign policy issues. We see in the last 15 to 20 years excellent contributions from anthropology, from sociology, from psychology, geography. There are various disciplines which are now involved in analyzing North Korea. Cultural studies, of course, as well, which have, in the context of which numerous publications have been published during the last 15, 20 years, which have been great contributions. So I would say to our students and to the next generation of scholars on North Korea that there is a basis now to actually conduct fruitful research on North Korea, and it's much easier nowadays to actually analyze this country than it has been before. But it is evenly important to get involved in the field.
Thank you very much for this message to the new generation of young scholars, and I'm very happy that you finished with that words. Now I have a question from Dr. Sang-Woo Kim, and he says that you mentioned the situation in which Korea is unable to respond positively to Germany's Indo-Pacific Declaration. Is there any way to overcome the dilemma of choosing between the US and China on the Korean side you mentioned?
Maybe I did not make this point as clear as I should have. Korea did respond positively to Germany's Indo-Pacific strategy, but not openly, not publicly. Like I said in the presentation, we had a similar phenomenon when the US published its own Indo-Pacific strategy, the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in 2017. We saw a similar restrained reaction from South Korea. And that is due to this challenging geopolitical situation in which the South Koreans are. I'm very sure that the German government and the EU understand the difficulty for the South Koreans of openly embracing any strategy, be it the US strategy or a European strategy. So in my point of view, and of course we have to do much more research on this, in my point of view, Europe's Indo-Pacific strategy offers an alternative, not in the sense that South Korea would openly embrace it, but more in specific initiatives in which a greater and increased cooperation between the EU and South Korea actually makes sense. If we are successful with that, let's take the German Indo-Pacific strategy as an example. If parts of this strategy make it to the new Koalitionsvertrag of the new government next year, this will lead to an increase in resources, hopefully, which then in turn, of course, could lead to more initiatives, expanded initiatives beyond what I said before, maritime or the focus on maritime security and non-traditional security threats. So Europe can provide alternatives, especially for South Koreans, that they don't have to choose, but that they can develop their own new Southern policy, which they already did. And then we have to identify overlaps between the new Southern policy and Germany's guidelines, or eventually the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. If this is successfully done, I think it doesn't have to be an open embrace by the South Koreans of an eventual European strategy, but more to provide offers to the South Koreans to increase cooperation where such an increased cooperation actually makes sense. I think it's not realistic to think that South Korea will in the future openly turn to Europe for kind of synchronizing their own Indo-Pacific strategy with that of Europe. I don't think anyone in Europe will believe this will happen. But this is not the point, I think. I think it's about making offers to the South Koreans, identifying potential fields for cooperation, and increase cooperation where such an increase actually makes sense and can contribute to maintaining peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula.
Thank you very much. We have two more questions. The first is from Kim Bo-hyun, and it's asked that, thank you for your presentation, Dr. Ballbach. Considering the EU common foreign policy making side, it has been well acknowledged both in practice and academia that EU national states' power still comes first than making a common European voice to deal with foreign affairs outside of EU. As an expert in the field, what do you think should be done to make a coordinated voice for European countries, including Germany, to be able to influence on Korea-related foreign affairs? Thank you.
This is a very important question, and I think we are in very as scholars working on this issue. I think this is a very exciting time, simply because it's we are in the middle of the debate within Europe to formulate a European Indo-Pacific strategy. A 5-page non-paper is already on the way in this regard. Like I said before, Germany, France, the Netherlands, and other countries now are already preparing like a blueprint for such a strategy, which then of course has to be further discussed in Brussels. The comment here, I think it's very true, especially in the security policy. The EU national states still come first. But if such a strategy is promoted, and this is where we actually are right now, is promoted by Germany and France with the support of other states like Sweden, Netherlands, and further countries of the EU. I think this can lead, of course, to a Europeanization of the policy guidelines. Yeah, it's very true. These decisions will not be made in Brussels first, but it is national state initiatives which basically then are further discussed in Europe. This also holds true for sanctions. The major autonomous sanctions of the EU against North Korea have been mainly prepared by the E3 and then have been pushed in Brussels and supported then by other states. So I think this is an extremely exciting time, and it is upon us now also to make our voices heard for the German, French, and further European decision makers to make them aware of our research findings in this regard, of the challenges, but also the opportunities of such a new European Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think the way to go is not to start this process in Brussels, but discuss with German, French, and other foreign ministries about their perspectives, and of course let them know how we see these issues. If we can influence them, that's a different question, but at least we can try. And like I said before, we are in contact with those decision makers, and at least make them aware. This is the job we can do as academics, make them aware of our research findings. There are excellent people in the ministries working there, and it's upon us now to share our research with them, work with them, not against them, to make our voices heard.
Thank you for your comment. Then I think we have time for one final question, and this is from Thomas Schäfer. I do not believe it is just to say that the policy of constructive engagement has failed. If that were the case, all attempts to make North Korea more cooperative and forthcoming, including the Sunshine Policy, have failed. I would argue that it is Pyongyang that refuses to budge. It takes two to tango. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador Schäfer, for your questions. For your question, when I say that, in my view, the critical engagement strategy has failed, I focused on the objectives and the strategic outline of what the critical engagement strategy was set to achieve. I'm not discounting the factor Pyongyang at all, and I fully agree with Ambassador Schäfer that, of course, many of the initiatives that have been proposed have been rejected ultimately also by Pyongyang. We know this from German experience as well. There were numerous German initiatives proposed to North and South Korea. Also, for example, in 2018, during the time of reconciliation between North and South Korea, and still proposed initiatives have been rejected, not only by Pyongyang, some also by Seoul. This, like I said, goes back to the point I made before. There are many factors playing into the EU's strategy in the region. Pyongyang, of course, is one of the major ones. I focused my critique here on the EU, but I fully agree with Ambassador Schäfer that, of course, the factor Pyongyang plays into this as well. The geopolitical challenges I mentioned during my presentation are another factor. Third-party pressures and by the US, all of these things ultimately play into the EU's policies on the Korean Peninsula. But I would still argue that if we take a closer look at what the critical engagement strategy aimed to achieve, and I told you the 3 points before: strengthening of the non-proliferation regime, a better human rights situation, and a more secure Korean Peninsula, then we have to be honest enough also in Europe to simply state that we did not achieve these objectives. And then I think it's time to be critical enough to have a debate on what we can improve. And like I said in my presentation, it's not the objectives that are wrong, but it's the method to achieve those objectives that are wrong. And a focus on sanctions alone, which we can see in the last couple of years now, certainly will not lead to the EU or will not lead to a situation in which the EU can actually achieve their regional objectives as stated in the critical engagement strategy. This was the main point I want to make. I did not want to discount the factor Pyongyang here, and it was important for Ambassador Schäfer to raise this point and also to openly state this in the audience. It certainly, like he said, it certainly takes two to tango, and there is plenty of blame to go around on all sides, and the factor Pyongyang certainly plays into this as well.
Well, thank you very much also to Ambassador Schäfer for his critical comment. And thank you, Dr. Ballbach. I think that's it for today. It was the fourth day of the inauguration conference of the Korea-Europe Center at the Institute of Korean Studies at Freie Universität Berlin. Tomorrow, unfortunately, will be the fifth and last day of the conference, and tomorrow's panel will be all about economics and civil society. And then we will have at guest lecturers Professor Werner Pascha, who will talk about the Republic of Korea's new Northern policy and new Southern policy in the context of international connectivity initiatives. And then Professor Ilse Lenz, who will give a talk about between globalization, gender inequality, and the nation. Thank you very much for your participation, and see you tomorrow.